James Hahn, and I'm going to just give a brief introduction before we proceed with the main event. So we're here to talk about district elections, about the California Voting Rights Act, and about how it affects us here locally on the coast. So first of all, I want to thank Mauro and Carrie for giving us the space. I also want to, yes, thank you. And I also want to acknowledge that we are on Ohlone land right now, before which this land was their land before European occupation. And I'm just going to go into a brief introduction and then tell you who's going to be coming after me. So I'm going to be speaking about district elections and just give you a very brief history about why they're important. Raul's going to dive a little bit deeper into redistricting in Half Moon Bay and how can we reduce barriers to voting access that minorities face. And Sabrina's going to talk about how we can bring district elections to our community in a fair and transparent manner. So just very briefly about me, my name is James. I'm a research assistant at the Estuary and Ocean Science Center. This is part of San Francisco State. I'm a native of Redwood City, and the Pillar Point Harbor, the San Mateo County coast, has always been kind of my second home. We've always come here as a family on the weekends. It's why I became a marine biology major. It's why I work at the Ocean Science Center right now. And I'm also a former city council candidate for the city of Redwood City. So instead of Houston, we have a problem, I wrote Coastside, we have a problem. It's a little cheesy. But so just to briefly lay it out, many cities have at-large elections, which means that if you live in a city, there could be many different neighborhoods, but everyone votes for all of the city council members in that town or locality. So what I have here on the screen is a little map of Menlo Park, and that's going to become relevant later. So you can see there's kind of 5 specific neighborhoods or districts drawn out. And before this year, everyone in the entire city voted for all of the city council members, which meant that in District 1 at the top, where you had a historically African American community, no one from that community, which is called Bellhaven, has ever been elected to the City Council of Menlo Park. So even though you have a majority-minority district in Menlo Park, we've never had a black city council person in Menlo Park, a Latino council person in Menlo Park. This is a big problem. So at-large elections dilute the voting power of minorities, and it's sometimes called racially polarized voting, where minority communities vote for a candidate and the rest of the city votes for a different candidate. And it prevents minorities from having adequate representation. At-large elections also make it harder for working people to run a political campaign because you have to campaign across the entire city and not just your district. And it also means that communities can't hold you accountable. If you're a person who lives in Bellhaven, but 80% of your votes came from the west side of Menlo Park, you don't necessarily have to listen to people in your community and what their concerns are. So the reason why district elections is something that a lot of local governments are implementing is because it empowers minority communities. It also makes elected officials more accountable, and it means that more working people of middle income, lower income, can run for office. So do district elections work? And this is just a quick example of district elections in San Francisco for their Board of Supervisors. They implemented district elections in 1976, and so in that election we got the first African American woman elected to the Board of Supervisors, the first Asian American elected to the Board of Supervisors, the first openly gay person elected to the Board of Supervisors, and the first unwed mother elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Now, of these 4 people, Carol Silver is still alive, and she said in 2011 that as a colleague of Harvey Milk, our legacy was to significantly shift the balance of power to younger and less affluent people in the city. We were the first supervisors who had roots in the ethnic communities of the city. So this is why district elections do work for our communities. So what I'm going to show you now is a brief video of how district elections came about in San Mateo County. And this is a little video put together by NBC Bay Area. And you'll have to bear with me while I click out of this to show you the video.
on when the color of your skin dictated your life.
And I was raised on the planet.
At 85, Gertrude Wilkes has many stories to tell about those times.
I was an angry black woman.
But now,
There's nobody there much to tell the story.
Gertrude means the story of her neighborhood in East Palo Alto, where she used to be mayor.
The shootouts, gang violence, as big as I am, as tough as I am,
She's afraid for her life.
I have to say to people, I'm scared.
Gertrude says cries for help are falling on deaf ears, blaming it on those in power.
Roll call, please.
The San Mateo County supervisors, who she says don't live in her kind of neighborhood. All 5 are white. Do you believe there's racism?
I know it is in the family. It's racism, yes. I know it is.
And she's not alone. Some people who feel the same way decided to sue the county for discrimination and for violating state voting laws.
You don't always know what this is alive and well.
Civil rights attorney Robert Rubin says the current system of voting countywide instead of electing supervisors by district makes it difficult for the underdogs, in this case minorities, to win.
It was a no-brainer. This is basically a civil rights issue, having equal votes in our district.
In the last 10 years, 5 people of color have run for a seat on the Board of Supervisors. Rose Jacobs Gibson, an East Palo Alto City Councilwoman, an African American, served 14 years before she termed out this January. 4 others, all Latino, lost.
It's impossible really to win because, first of all, it's controlled. It's controlled by the old boys club here in San Mateo.
According to the latest numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau, in San Mateo County, the top 3 racial groups are whites at nearly 42% of the population, Asian Pacific Islanders 28%, Latinos 25%. But if you go by city, there's a very different breakdown. At the top in Daly City, Asian Pacific Islanders 56%, and in East Palo Alto, Latinos make up nearly 65%.
We put before the voters 2 other times, and the voters didn't want district elections.
Supervisor Adrian Tissier says this isn't a city council race. She's concerned the new system of electing supervisors by district will fracture the county.
It gets very myopic. You know, we are a safety net provider, and we provide those services throughout the county. You know, whether it's health services, human services, law enforcement, our jail.
In a move to avoid the courtroom, the county put the issue on the November 2012 ballot in Measure B. It passed at almost 60%. The county has been holding meetings during the summer, asking the people to draw their own district lines.
It will not be a perfect fix. However, it allows communities of interest to have their own voice and a louder voice.
Racism starts at the top.
Gertrude welcomes the change, but remains wary, thanks to her background in politics as former mayor of EPA, when she says she fought for those who needed it most.
I used to be that voice inside.
Now she's hoping that voice is on the way to the top. Stephanie Trump, NBC, Bay Area News.
So when was that?
That's a great question. So the video was made in 2013. The county was sued in 2011, and voters approved Measure B a year after that. So this video came the year after Measure B, and around the time the case was settled between the county and the plaintiffs. So what made all of this possible, what made this lawsuit successful, was the California Voting Rights Act. It was passed about 20 years ago, and it makes it easier for minority groups to dismantle at-large elections because you no longer need to prove that a specific candidate lost due to racially polarized voting. You just need to show that racially polarized voting is happening. So, and also the Voting Rights Act also requires the local government in question to pay all legal and court fees for the plaintiff if they win their case, and that's even when the cases reach a settlement. So district elections are coming to Menlo Park thanks to the Voting Rights Act, and because of the Voting Rights Act, Menlo Park will elect its first city council member from the Bellhaven community this year, which is great. So what about us? And that's what Raul is going to talk about next, and if you'll bear with us, we'll just get his laptop set up so you can see his presentation. Thanks.
first time. Okay, well, hi everyone, and thanks for the introduction, James. My name is Raul Macias. I'm an attorney with the ACLU of California. I work out of the Sacramento office, actually, but thanks for having me. So, let's see. I'm planning today on covering a little bit on the California Voting Rights Act, but also give you a sense of what is likely to come next. So, that, assuming that Half Moon Bay decides to move to the two districts, I'll walk you through a little bit what that process is likely to look like, and maybe some practices to try to get better community input and outcomes that maximize minority voting power. So those areas we can cover. I think the introduction and some of the history was really helpful. And also, bear with me, I just made this presentation. It's my first time giving it, but I'll do my best. I might have to do a little reading from my slides here. So I think you all know Half Moon Bay was threatened with a CVRA lawsuit. They were sent a notice letter, and I'm going to cover a little bit about the sort of timeline that triggers. As James mentioned, so the attorney who sent the letter alleged that there's racially polarized voting. To avoid litigation, Half Moon Bay would have to adopt district elections. And actually, I think my next slide is going to cover a little bit more about why that is. But so Half Moon Bay currently uses at-large elections, and I think you did a good job covering what that is. But in other words, that's everyone in the city is voting for all of the candidates. There are five members. They represent the whole city, elected at large. And I think this is something that's important to note, because we'll talk about it a little bit later. But there are overlapping terms in San Mateo, meaning that not all 5 members are elected in the same year. So part of what we're also going to think about and talk about a little later is how that sequencing will work, because that's part of also what's going to be part of this process of deciding which district comes up first. And so that's also an important area where the city council is going to need to hear input. Okay, so what is the CVRA? Just a little more background here. The law was passed in response to some court cases that had really made it harder to challenge at-large elections. There was something, not to go too much into history, but voting rights attorneys talked about, under federal law, they do what's called putting the cart before the horse. They say that minority communities have to prove, essentially, that they have a remedy, prove that they can make up a majority of that minorities can make up a majority of a district before they can, just to meet the threshold of even bringing a case to claim that their votes are diluted. And so under the CVRA, it makes it much easier. It just goes to this question of racially polarized voting. What that is, the basics of what that means is normally a demographer, someone will look at data from precincts that are primarily minority, where they're primarily minority voters, and try to get a sense of hopefully there's an election where there's a minority candidate on the ballot and a non-minority candidate on the ballot. And so they'll look at a minority district and look at hopefully a precinct with heavily white community, and try to get a sense, are they voting differently? So here they might be looking, are Latino voters voting primarily for the Latino candidates? That's part of it. They need to vote cohesively as well. And then are white voters primarily voting for the non-Latino candidates? And if so, that's how you show there's racially polarized voting. There's obviously a lot of case law and different things on getting into what actually qualifies, but those are sort of the basics. Are different communities voting differently, and is that primarily racially based? So that's what's being alleged here in Half Moon Bay. And actually, let me just say a little bit more about this. The CVRA it took effect in 2001. We saw it beginning around 2010 is when we saw the impact of this. School districts, I think there were over 160 school districts have converted from at-large to district elections. The Central Valley changed dramatically how members are elected, and we've seen a lot more Latino members elected through the CVRA and this conversion from at-large to district elections. It's also worth noting that every city that's tried to, so far, every city that has tried to contest one of these notices has lost, and it's resulted in significant like really significant attorney's fees that they've had to pay out. As James mentioned, part of the statute says that if you receive notice, if you don't convert, you're subject to paying these attorney's fees if you lose. And so these are attorney's fees in the millions for some pretty small cities, actually. There's another case going to trial by the attorney that sent the notice letter here in Santa Monica, so we'll probably get more evidence that cities tend to fail if they try to challenge this, because the threshold is just showing that racially polarized voting exists. And so far that's, it's cities and it could be special districts, it could be school districts, they're discouraged from, they don't have a lot of incentive to fight this because they're likely to lose and then have to pay significant attorney's fees. So how will the district election affect you? So district election, one member from the city council would come from your community. There may be an opportunity to draw a majority-minority district. I'm going to explain a little bit more about what that means, but I don't know. I mean, you would all know better than I do if that seems likely here in Half Moon Bay, whether there's an area where the Latino community is concentrated. And James spoke to a number of the benefits of having a member from your district, but I think one of the benefits or the idea is that the member would have a better understanding of the unique needs of that community. And there's also potentially this issue of representation of where you have racially polarized voting. If you were able to draw a majority-minority district, potentially the Latino community could elect a Latino candidate. So I want to give folks a sense of what the demographer is going to be looking at when they're getting into districts is the citizen voting age population. Now each district has to have the same, roughly the equal number of people, but that doesn't mean they have to have an equal number of citizen voting age population. So what they're going to want to do if you're looking at drawing a majority-minority district, it's that 21% Latino. So potentially they would try to draw one majority-minority district. It's not to get too into the weeds of the law around this. I mean, but they can't. The demographers are allowed to consider race in the drawing of districts without it being the primary thing that they're looking at. And at the same time, if they have the opportunity to draw a majority-minority district and don't draw a majority-minority district, then they're subject to a federal Voting Rights Act case like we talked about before. So in all likelihood, if they can draw a majority-minority district, they will be doing that. And you get a sense if there's 21%, they call it CVAP, citizen voting age population of Latino, then they're likely to be able to draw at least one majority-minority district. And that's likely what they'll try to do.
Can I ask you?
Yes, please.
Whether the district would have to be
contiguous? It is. It will have to be contiguous. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but yeah, that is one of the requirements. So there's this idea that district elections can give a greater voice, right? Your voice, instead of being one of 100%, it'll be one of 20% of the voting age population. And potentially, if you're part of a community that, let's say, makes up 10% of the voting age population in all of Half Moon Bay, missed a capitalized letter there, apologize. But if you're a concentrated area, you could make up 50% of a council district, right? And so that's part of the idea of how district elections can empower minority voting groups. And kind of a basic example, but I think that helps illustrate. So there are a couple things to think about. Well, there are a lot of things to think about here, but you can see how you draw the lines is important, right? This would be an example of what they call cracking, where you take a minority population that's together, you can divide them up, and now the minority population doesn't make a majority of a single district, right?
What did you call it again?
Cracking. There's two common things. The other term is that you might hear is packing. Packing and cracking are two common things that they're not supposed to do. But packing would be if, let's say, they're it doesn't work so well with 16 people, but the idea would be if you have a minority population that could potentially make up a majority in two districts, instead you try to put them all into one, so to dilute their power through making them all vote together.
So it'd be like south side of Kelly
Yeah.
and the north side of Kelly.
Yeah.
But we're all,
Redrawing it.
we're
Mhm.
all one area, our neighborhood. There's
Yeah.
There's a, I guess, right, because it seems like things are kind of spread out all over the city. And that, it seems to me like that would be one district. I mean, I don't know yet.
When they get into crazy maps, right, where they're drawing it in this bizarre way to pack people,
Right, and that happens. I'm sure you've all been hearing about these gerrymandering cases around partisan gerrymandering, and this is what tends to happen.
Yeah. That's
Especially, there's this opportunity to do that, right, where we have cities that are heavily, or they're more minority, more democratic, and you just draw them on one district, and instead of, so there's a tendency to use the packing in those instances. So here's an example that I like of what can happen when you do this sort of cracking. So in Koreatown in LA, 1 square mile, so a concentrated area. But when districts were drawn in 1990, it was split into 4 city council districts and 5 state assembly districts. This one small area, everyone took a little piece of it, right? Took a little piece. And so there's no member that speaks for that community, right? So and Koreatown is a concentrated Korean population, Korean American population, but you just carve them up and you might wind up with a lack of representation. No one to speak for that community.
Who is determining that though? Like how
Drawing
are
those
people
districts?
able to do that? Yeah.
So, this was at the city level in LA, the city council. I think at that time it was the city council who was drawing the lines. I can't remember if 1990. So at the state level, now we have, for the state drawing the assembly and senate districts, we have an independent commission. At the time in 1990, it would have been the legislature drawing, but I can't remember. There were a couple of, that might have been the year that they couldn't reach agreement with Governor Wilson, and then maybe it went to the judges. Anyways, I don't remember, but it would have been, so I don't recall who drew in 1990. But yeah, at the state level now, there's an independent commission. So the idea is by keeping communities intact, there's minority communities can have more voting power. So we're going to go a lot more into this, but okay. And by the way, this all assumes there's racially polarized voting, right? It only makes sense if that community is voting as cohesively as a voting bloc, right? So, okay. So let me go into some of these examples of things that voting rights attorneys and demographers have done to try to empower voting minorities. So majority minority district, I think is likely what they'll be able to do here, but that's where a minority group composes a numerical working majority of that district. By working majority, it needs to be, that's of citizen voting age population, right? Not just of all residents of the district. And then on top of that, sometimes you'll find, especially amongst historically disenfranchised communities, you're gonna find lower registration rates, lower turnout. And so what the demographer might say, 50% plus 1 isn't good enough. We might need 55% Latino to actually have a working majority, because if that community is turning out at lower rates, is registered at lower rates, even though the citizen voting age population might make 50% of the district, you might actually need a higher number to make a real working majority. Crossover districts. So this is where perhaps if the minority group isn't large enough to compose a majority, but if their votes are combined with a similarly minded community in the majority, they can combine to elect a preferred candidate. Does that make sense to folks what that means? So that would mean if there were, and I'll just keep using Latinos as an example, because I think that's kind of the primary issue here, is that if there's a Latino population that maybe didn't make 50%, but the demographer says, oh, but looking at how these precincts that are primarily white voters, they are voting similarly as Latino voters, we can combine them and that could form a working majority. And these are all allowable under court precedents. Minority coalition district is also allowable, although a little more, has subject to challenge. But a coalition district is when two, again, minority groups can be combined to form a majority group. So I think we saw that there's a 6% Asian American citizen voting age population. So perhaps if they're in a concentrated area, it can be combined with some Latino voters. You might be able to form a majority district or a minority coalition district. And an influence district is another possibility, although I think ideally you'll get that majority-minority district, but it's where if a minority group is not large enough to compose the majority of a district, it is still substantial enough in size to influence election outcomes. In other words, if there are significant voting blocks, and maybe they make up a third of a district, that's enough where you would think that the member running in that district can't just ignore that group. So that's another possibility. And also, you might, something to think about when you're looking at the maps later, there could be a majority-minority district, but also a Latino influence district. That might be something that's possible and desirable. That if there's still a significant block of Latino voters in another part, it might make sense to try to combine them into a single district. Okay, so what happens next? So assuming that Half Moon Bay, and I'm sorry, I didn't have a chance to read that article you sent. I did look at the agenda, and I know that the city council is considering moving, and sounded that it's a strong possibility that they're not going to fight the notice. So assuming but right now they have 45 days to pass an ordinance to adopt district-based elections. If it doesn't, then the plaintiff can file a complaint. So this is sort of the key 45 days. What are they going to do? They're already thinking about it. I think I saw in that article that their date is April 20th that they need to decide. If they don't pass an ordinance, if they do pass an ordinance, they enter this 90-day safe harbor to finish the districting process. The plaintiff cannot file a complaint during that period. So that's what's meant here by safe harbor. If they manage to complete this process in that 90 days, so within that safe harbor, the plaintiff's attorney fees are capped at $30,000. So that's another heavy incentive for the city to get this done in that 90 days. The city is then likely to need to hire a demographer or consultants
They've already done that.
So they've already. Oh, do you know who they've hired?
I'll tell you, it's in the article.
Okay.
See the front?
I think it's under my briefcase actually.
It's right here, Mara.
Okay.
Sorry.
So if so now let's say they passed the ordinance. They decided we're moving to city to district-based elections. So they're going to have to, at that point, hold 2 public hearings. And we're talking about minimums here. And we'll talk a little later, but they might want to think about going above the minimum. But 2 public hearings over a period of no more than 30 days to receive input regarding the composition of the districts. So this is their first chance to hear from the public about, I think James mentioned communities of interest, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that.
So it's National Demographics Corporation.
Okay, we'll have to look them up afterwards. Because, yeah, there are different ones. I think I know national. And after all the maps are drawn, the city will then publish and make available. In theory, they only have to make available 1 draft map, but I think you're going to want to encourage the city council to have multiple options here to give you something to compare. And because not all city council members are elected each election cycle, the city is also going to at that time release the potential sequence of the district elections. So in other words, which one, there might be a majority-minority district, there might be an influence district. Do those come first in the first round? Do they come in the second round? And let me get through the process, but we might talk about why that's important to think about.
So this would really encourage people from those particular districts to step up to run, right? I would assume, because I can see that's the real positive here, because
Yeah.
there haven't been a lot of Latino people running as far as I remember.
Yeah.
I've been here quite a while.
Right.
So, and also things are really spread out here. There's not like one pocket. They're like in different pockets, right?
And that's a potential problem for drawing a majority-minority district.
But I would think that by doing this, I'm trying to think of what's a positive, because we're kind of small. We know we know people on the council, and we might have voted for them, but not like them now, but
So when we get to and maybe I'll just also, it's worth talking a little bit about alternatives, but okay, so here we are in the process. These are the things after their first 2 hearings, before they've drawn the maps. Okay, and so I'm sorry. So now they've published the first round of maps. They've released the order of those districts. So now they have to hold 2 more hearings, and now they have 45 days now. And the public's again invited to give input. Which maps do you like? What do you think of the sequence of these maps? They're supposed to consider, in the sequencing of these districts, to give special consideration to the purposes of the California Voting Rights Act, will take into account the preferences expressed by members of the districts. Let me say a little bit what that means. Is that the idea with the CVRA is to enhance minority voting power. So instinctively you might think, okay, we've drawn a majority Latino district. That one should come up first. Let's get them elected in the first round of new elections into this district. And that might be a good option here, because I don't think you're going to be using these maps until 2020, is my sense, since we're already too close to the next elections. Although I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's too late. But one of the things they got with the sequencing, and this provision was added later after some experience with the CVRA, is that when you're working with communities that are, again, historically disenfranchised, the idea here is they might have lower registration rates, they might have lower turnout rates, and there might not be people who have run there before or who have campaign experience. And so in Escondido in San Diego, there was a situation where someone sent a notice letter, they agreed to convert to district elections, they drew a majority minority district, and they said we want it up first. Or actually at the time there wasn't really that option. The city thought it needs to come up first, otherwise we might be at risk of being sued. They ran a candidate, but because registration was low, turnout was low amongst Latino community, what wound up happening was one of the old incumbents won the district. He also had a kind of Hispanic sounding last name. This was a candidate who was very anti-immigrant, anti-Latino community, but wound up winning the district again. And so something to think about and just is whether, if with that district coming up first, is that community, do they have the capacity to, who's going to move in to register voters, to work on turnout, to make sure good candidates are recruited who are ready to run and know how to run. And maybe if the elections won't be till 2020, that seems like a good amount of time. But just something to keep in mind of why the sequencing is potentially important. So after that, the city's going to come back, they're going to release their final map with the final sequencing, and they're going to have to hold one more hearing to give the public one more opportunity to comment on that choice. So those are sort of the minimums of what to expect. Okay, so participating in the line drawing process can help ensure a good outcome, and this is something that I believe in, and I think is true. So we're going to go in more to that, but first, who's going to be drawing the lines? Well, City Council, after public input, is ultimately the one who can vote on adopting these maps for the new districts. That's unless, there is the possibility they could appoint an independent commission or committee for drawing lines. I think Sabrina's going to talk a little bit more about what Menlo Park did. It's something, I think, what likely to do that, what would have to happen is the City Council would need to reach an agreement with the plaintiff's attorneys to say, do you agree to allow us more time so that we can do something like that?
It appears that's happened, and that it's going to be 2020.
I don't know enough about the specifics here. They can't do that. They wouldn't be able to do that if it pushed back the date of. In other words, they can't try to buy more time just to get another round of elections under the current model. And so I don't really know how that's going to affect things here. Because I think arguably the plaintiff's attorney could say, no, we want something done before the November election. But I don't know how that would work, because you also have primaries. It's things are tough here, but in theory, a plaintiff's attorney can agree to more time. I think that's what you would need to do if you wanted to go this route of an independent commission or committees. There's no, I know you've been in touch with Common Cause, and potentially they could come talk to you more about this. There isn't, there's belief among some folks that you can potentially get a better outcome, especially if there's a feeling that you can't trust the city council to do this in a objective way. I mean, that would be the reason to do this. But the downside is it could potentially take more time. It could potentially, there's costs associated with taking more time too. You asked about districts need to be contiguous. Yes, they do need to be contiguous. And they also, in theory, need to be compact. There's no real objective standard for that. It's kind of an eye test to whether a district is compact or not. And they also have to have substantially the same population. And that's not citizen voting age population, that's just overall population. So about giving input, what's important in terms of hearing from the community here isn't necessarily any special expertise. This is about it's getting this idea of what a community of interest is. So how to give that input, how to be heard, is to provide community of interest testimony in front of the city council at one of these hearings that they're going to host. You want to ask the city council to keep your community whole, and they need to hear from you. Well, what is that community? And it might, and we're going to talk about some of the questions that you might ask yourself when you're thinking about a community of interest, because it does go beyond just race or ethnicity. There's other things that you might want to talk about. So where do I live? Where do I worship? Where do I socialize? Where do I shop? I'm not kidding about that. These are things the courts consider. Where do I shop? Where do my children play sports? Where do my children go to school? All these things are things that may be something you identify as your community. The people my kids play softball with or soccer with. That's my community, and here's where those lines, or here's where we live. What are the community spaces? A space like this, who are the folks that you think of as the community that use this space? The parks, the community centers, shopping centers. Do my neighbors and I share the same interests in schools? Housing, crime, transit. Transit's a big one often. Health conditions, land use and environmental conditions are all things that you might think of as what makes up your community, or who you want to vote with. Who are the people that you share special interests with? So do I share cultural or racial background or identity with others? Do I share language with others? Is an important one. Do I have similar concern to others around me because of money, income, or politics? Maybe politics isn't the right way to say it, because partisanship isn't necessarily something that they're going to look at, but but there's other ways to talk about your same belief system. So are we similar because of socioeconomic status, education levels, housing? So do I live in maybe I live in an area that's primarily renters. That might be something that I consider part of my community of interest. So these are all potential things to present to the city council as why your district, we've talked a lot about the majority minority district, right? But that might make one district, 4 other districts are going to be drawn too. And so everyone should be thinking about what is my community that I want to be, lumped in with as part of my voting, who we're going to elect a member together. So does anyone have any questions about that part before I go?
Well,
on?
just you mentioning the housing piece, there's been some interest by some members of the community in looking at rent control or rent stabilization.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it seems like that could be a group of people that are renters that would want to influence the outcome of a decision.
Right, or elect a city council member who is advocating for renters' rights, or something. That's the kind of thing that potentially would make sense or that you could advocate for in your district. Okay. So here's some things about good districting. These are sort of going above and beyond just a minimum. So hold more hearings, right? The city can ask the plaintiff to extend the timeline to hold more hearings, because you can see that they have 45 days, right, to decide, and then 90 days to get this done. The city doesn't necessarily have an organizer who's going to be dedicated to going out and talking to communities about the importance of districting and for folks to get themselves organized. It might feel they need more than 90 days. At this point, they're going to need the plaintiff to agree to that kind of thing, but if the city council said, well, we'd like more time, or if you all were to urge the city council to ask for more time in exchange for holding more hearings, maybe one in different geographic locations, thinking about the weekends, or for some people midday is better, but for others evenings might be a better time to get public input. You're also going to think about simultaneous translations or other accommodations that people might need. Transparency and disclosure are issues that come up often. So who are the city council members? Sometimes you might want it explicitly known that any conversations between city council members and the demographer should be made public. Because what are they asking for? Are they asking about where I'm an incumbent? Where do I live? What's my district like? Am I asking to make sure that sometimes you see really odd things, that the lines look a little funny, and you realize, oh, they drew them in a way to make sure all 5 incumbents are in different districts. So those are the kinds of things that sometimes transparency in terms of who is the demographer talking to the city council members, and if so, what about? But also making sure that the data is as public as possible. That they're upfront about the criteria that they're going to be using to decide districts. And I think better practices include cities they launch websites dedicated to this, so where they put resources for voters. Every public hearing is noticed on that website. The maps are put on that website. The data is put on that website. So in other words, not making folks, not a lot of people are going to know how to go find a city council agenda and to look up, what's coming up. And so having a dedicated website, I think, is ideal. I mean, other things I don't have on here, but if you have a really good demographer, demographers are potentially open to talking to the public and answering questions from the public about your question, because you might have questions about, is there a way to look at the renters, and is that something to consider? And really good demographers, or if it's part of their contract with the city, will be willing to talk to the public and take questions, or potentially even give you a draft map that shows some of your considerations if you send a letter. So those are some considerations. There are resources. I'll email you some links to resources. Sabrina, so to share with all the folks. Did you guys take a sign-in list with emails or anything that we can?
We know everybody here,
Okay.
and we're going to post these presentations and the links on the coastsideprogressive.org website.
Great. And then I want to take questions, and also just want to plug one other thing that folks are probably aware of, but just in case, is that San Mateo, this will be the first year that San Mateo is participating in what's called the Voters' Choice Act. Is everyone familiar with this? Mm-hmm. So 2015, San Mateo held a pilot election. It's kind of similar to what's happening this year, but there's some differences. Traditionally, during your general election years at least, the county has used what's called a polling site model, where a polling site represents a precinct of roughly 1,000 voters, but sometimes smaller. Under this new model called the Voters' Choice Act, polling sites are going away. So there's going to be 85% fewer in-person locations to vote at. Instead, they're being replaced with what are called vote centers. Vote centers, the idea is that they're going to be located in centralized locations. Some of the advantages are, some of them will open beginning 10 days before the election, so 11 days total. More of them are going to open beginning 4 days before the election, beginning 3 days before the election, so 4 days total. You can vote at any vote center, so you don't have to go just to your assigned polling site. You can also access same-day registration at the vote centers, which is another advantage. The county is also going to be opening what are called drop-off sites. These are kind of like mailboxes, because another change is that every voter in the county is going to receive a vote-by-mail ballot, so that you can return it at a drop-off site. I believe San Mateo is also offering prepaid postage, so you'll be able to also just put it in the mailbox. So how many people are vote-by-mail voters? Okay, so for vote-by-mail voters, this isn't much of a change. You're going to get your vote-by-mail vote or your ballot like before, you can drop it off at a drop-off site, a vote center, or your mailbox. But if you're an in-person voter, in all likelihood, your in-person voting site is going to be further and significantly further, right? There's
And I heard from Mark Church recently at a meeting that he's our top election official in the county, that the voting, what are they called, sites?
vote center.
Centers. The voting centers are going to be closing at 5 p.m. So for people who work, it's going to be difficult. So the more we can all do to get the word out to people that we know that, there will be voting centers. It's going to be a little confusing about where they're located, but they close at 5. That's important for people to know, and then they can vote by mail.
So on election day, it'll still be 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. That's still required. But you're right. For most vote centers, on those early voting days, they're going to be open just usual business hours, so probably 9 to 5. You'll be able to look up the sites on the county website. It'll also, when you get your sample ballot, it'll have all the locations and the hours on it. They will be open 2 weekends, though, some of them at least, and the ones that are open 3 days before the election will also be open on. So the second round of vote centers that open will be open for 1 weekend, and so there's that advantage. But if you're an in-person voter, it's just look up where your vote centers are, because in all likelihood it's not at the place that you're used to voting at.
Will you be able to drop off the vote by mail at the vote centers?
Yes, you will. And if you have lost your vote by mail ballot, you can go to the vote center and vote as you normally did. So it's a big change. San Mateo is one of 5 counties that's trying it this year, and so we're likely to learn a lot from it. It's a really big change, though. Okay. Any other questions?
So I had one question. You were saying that the populations need to be the same in the districts. They need to be compact. But can one district be like the size of a mobile home park? And can another one be a much larger population?
Right. So sometimes the idea with compact, sometimes the population is going to dictate that, right? You might have a district that's big to cover areas where there aren't a lot of people. I think what's getting at compact is that if the city tried something that are just like 5 stripes that go all the way down, like, well, there's better ways of doing that where you can keep people a district that's closer together. But sometimes the population is going to dictate that. The entire city has to be covered in a district, and so, there's assembly districts, down south, sort of east of or around the San Bernardino area. There's desert. There aren't people, and so there's districts that they look like they cover 1/8 of the state. But
how many U.S. representatives are there for the state of Wyoming?
Well, probably 1. So. Right, but the compact requirement is the population is going to dictate some of that.
So yeah, you could have a neighborhood that was really dense, that was a very geographically small district.
And part of what we're getting at is there's, again, some of the probably gerrymandered districts you've seen before where there are tentacles going out in different ways that don't make sense. And so let's get rid of those and do one more compact district.
Well, in our area, how many do you think there'll be, or is it just relative to the population?
I can't quite. From what? Yeah.
There's 5 council members, so as long as that doesn't change, there would be 5 districts.
But things could potentially. I don't know enough about what would happen here, but what some places do is they might decide, well, we would like a mayor elected at large, and then we'll go to 5 city council members. I don't know if they're going to keep the current model.
Actually, the city council at their meeting this past Tuesday did talk about exactly that. They talked about the potential for having an at-large elected mayor and then have five, the way I understood it was five district elected council people. So that seemed to be something they were interested in. How fast that could roll out, I don't know.
Sabrina, did you tell me the other day that Moon Ridge is unincorporated? Were you
That's
there?
right. Moon Ridge, which is a community to our south, a little bit south of, well, actually, it's literally right across from Ocean Colony on the east side of Highway 1. And that community, while most people assume it's within the city boundaries because of the fact that it's surrounded by the city, it is not within the city boundaries. It's actually unincorporated. And so that population of people, their only representation currently is the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors. And unlike the unincorporated areas to our north, which would be Miramar, El Granada, Princeton, Moss Beach, and Montera, those communities have some form of advisory representation because, I say we because I live over there, but we have the Mid-Coast Community Council, which is an advisory council to the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors, and the Board of Supervisors sends a representative to those meetings so that there is a conduit between the community and the Board of Supervisors so that we have a little bit more connection to our representatives. But with Moon Ridge, there is nothing like that.
And everything south of Moon Ridge, like the people that live up on, like Irish Ridge or Tunitas Creek.
It's all gully.
That's all unincorporated, including
is that
Pescadero.
part of Moon Ridge unincorporated, that section?
Moon Ridge is unincorporated.
But isn't that like continuing out?
Well, I guess you could say that, but it's literally across the street from Ocean
Well, I know
Colony.
that, I know
Yeah.
that seems very unfair, but.
Yeah. So it would be an easy, if the city decided to annex Moon Ridge, that would be, I would think, a pretty easy annexation because it's
It's
much,
And
it's
such
just,
a neighborhood, yeah.
it's just right there. Yeah, it's literally across the street from another
That's
part of the city.
we brought that up a while back, maybe a couple years ago. And about trying to bring Moon Ridge votes into Half Bay, and they won not one Moon Ridge because the voting population in Moon Ridge is increasing. Yeah, so we're talking about I know a good number. With the 21% that's already in Half Bay, that might be the other 6%, 4% to make it 25%.
What about the south of Main Street?
The south is still Half Bay.
Yeah, I know,
that's
but that's a
pretty-
large Hispanic
Yeah.
population.
I don't know, it
Yeah.
seems
It's a
to
large
me
one.
that Moon Ridge issue is a really important issue.
And I think the last time that was brought up, there was probably a different makeup on the city council. So it might be something that people that live in Moon Ridge or have family there want to bring up to the current city council for consideration. I don't know if that's happened or not because I don't follow the city council that closely.
Well, we haven't brought it up yet, but one of the things that actually is happening, the city council might listen to us, the Latino population, like they saw that yesterday. We had a listening session with the Latino population, and it was about 90 of us, and city council was not expecting that. So that kind of made a dent, on the view of the population, well, the Latino population. And now when they offer, they're gonna have another listening session, and that might even bring us, bring out more numbers. We're talking about maybe over 100 people present. And the subject that we talked about, we discussed, housing, rent control. We know something is going to be difficult to go against, real estate, they really have that's who affected, Pacifica. So Half Bay, they already want to meet with us. I got an email from the mayor saying, real estate, some of the real estate agent I'm going to meet with you. So we're gonna do that pretty soon and see what they have to say. Half Bay, it's been going about the marijuana growth in Half Bay. and that's the even kind of rent control of marijuana. They had the biggest issues that we have with the Latino population. I don't know where the city council got the idea that the Latino population wanted to grow marijuana in Half Bay, but they saw that yesterday that pretty much 99% of Latino population is against it. So
That's really good. I'm just kidding.
not good for business. Either.
Well, it seems to me that that there is a large number of people that live in Moon Ridge. I don't know what the numbers are exactly, but I have walked the whole community, and it seemed like there must be several hundred people living.
Yeah. So that in probably about half of the population there is they come in of age, one population. So that's what I'm saying. That's why the city will not want Moon Ridge to be part of Half Bay as a body.
Well, how long does that process take? Like,
Annexing?
how long does that take? Does anybody know? How
Annexing
long
a city, I imagine they'd have to vote on it.
Yeah,
like
but
the
I mean, is
population.
that like a year? I mean, how long does the wheel?
Like who votes? Everybody or just the council members?
I don't know. I would hope that the people who are being annexed would have a chance to vote on
Yeah, I'm
whether-
not sure how the annexation works, but it wouldn't be hard for us to find out more about that, and I'd be happy to look into it.
Can
I
I s-
haven't done that in the past.
Oh, sorry, but has anyone been in touch with the attorney Shankman, who's doing the case
No.
here?
Well,
I am just wondering, because it does seem like a shame if they say, well, we'll draw lines, but nothing will happen until 2020. I mean, potentially, it's worth at least asking the attorney who's bringing the case. Maybe one of his demands could be, we want to finish. Well, that seems like a slightly separate issue, but also, I mean, I was thinking more. Let's finish the lines. We want a special election, a special election primary for the maybe two new city council districts. In other words, saying the June primary doesn't count. We want a new primary, special election over the summer, and then a runoff in November. So for two of these new districts, and because it sounds like I'm assuming what the city council will want is to buy themselves 2 years to implement this, and wait until 2020.
yeah, that's what they said they wanted.
That would be if we make a district to be south of Maine in Moon Ridge. That's what the more dense is the population is.
But I guess it's worth asking the attorney Shankman like what he's working on in terms of a settlement with the city, and if there's any chance of demanding a runoff over this, a new primary over the summer. So in other words, invalidate whatever happens in June. How many members are up in June?
In November, right?
November.
Yeah.
There is no primary?
No.
Oh, well then even easier. Then this probably will be implemented should be implemented for 2018.
They're saying it won't be.
Well, Shankman should absolutely demand it. I mean, that's.
Huh.
So what would be the steps to take if we want to incorporate Moon Ridge into Half Bay?
That's not my area. How do you do
So
something like that?
that's a separate issue, but it's an important issue, and
Yeah, that is, and that's an important issue. But I mean, also, if they're asking to wait until 2020, I don't know how they're going to. I mean, that seems kind of ridiculous to me. That maybe it does make sense to get this done, like to urge the city council to do this as quickly as possible, so that you can get these on the November ballot. I mean, they might say, well, if we stretch this out, if they take the full 45 days, which it sounds like they'll do, then they get 90 days. They take a full 90 days. That puts you into, let's see, May, June, July, right? That still seems early enough to me that those districts would be the ones used in November
well,
this year.
I'm guessing he sent the letter in time to get it done
For November?
for November. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm guessing.
So, if that's what they were talking about, the council,
If Moon Ridge gets incorporated, that would probably make different district lines.
Well, you're always going to have to refresh the district lines based on the census. So, and we didn't talk about that.
And the census is in 2020.
I mean, I think Moon Ridge getting incorporated is a big political
It
football. It's not gonna
definitely,
happen
definitely is.
in
It's going to take
6
some.
or 8 months.
Yeah, it's going to take some time.
but I would follow up with the attorney to find out, are these maps going to be done in time for November? Because we want that. I mean, I don't see why you should have to. If what folks want are district elections, And why should you hold another at-large election this year? That's interesting. There's no primary, so you
For city council.
so you have plurality take all.
Yeah.
That's not great either. Those are also systems that
We're in the
aren't great.
countryside.
I did have one quick question,
Yeah.
Ronald, about you're talking about drawing communities based on different things, and so would that include? I think you might have mentioned it, but would that include like, let's say there's a community of folks who live like around a creek, and there's special issues related to that creek. So like an approach that takes into account the natural environment and like what the
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Like that kind of land use or environmental concern that we all share this interest in this creek
yeah,
and what happens to it, and we want a member elected is also concerned about that and representing our united interest.
Flooding on our street.
Exactly. A flooding zone would be
Street
another
floods.
one, or
Really bad.
yeah,
Yeah.
you could.
Yeah, well, you are.
As part of doing the mapping, would they say that we need more districts than we have?
So the issue with absolutely, I mean, this is in fact as a remedy in some places where CDRA seats have been brought, they've been required to draw more districts, but there's an expense that comes with that. I don't imagine, or I imagine your city council members are, it's a part-time job, and maybe it's not a lot of money, but maybe if they have staff or other things, usually that's what comes into consideration, is that they're like, well, we have more council members, that's more salaries, more staff. I'm not sure if it, in 5, for a community this small seems is more the norm. It's where you have big places like LA. I think LA has 13 members or maybe 15. I mean, the bigger you get, usually the more members you're going to want.
And if they're gonna add an elected, at-large elected mayor, that's gonna add a 6th person if that were to happen. So.
Right. And other times this comes up is when you have like, maybe the minority population makes up a third of the city, and you think like, oh, maybe we'd want to draw 2 majority minority districts and make it 6 members or something like that. You know, sometimes those things come up.
It's a bit of a puzzle, all of this, trying to figure it out.
Yeah, so this will come up, and then in 2022 you'll draw the lines again, and
after the census.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the good thing, is that you're not stuck with your lines forever. You know, they do
practice run.
Right. 2021 you'll work on redrawing.
Find out what you did wrong, and
But yeah, I mean, I would definitely at least raise this to the city council and with the attorney who brought this. Like, is this going to be implemented in time for November? And if not, why not? I mean,
I'll ask about that.
yeah.
Okay.
Because that is something that happens. They try to say, oh, maybe we can stretch this out to get one more election in to help out a couple of incumbents.
Yeah.
Because I like being a council member.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much.
Is this yours?
Yeah.
And I'm happy to.
I'm going to get through mine real quick. I appreciate everybody's patience. I know this is kind of a dry topic this evening for a rainy night. So, James, how do I get this to go full screen?
You just need to go to view.
View? Where's that? View.
There you go.
Oh, view. Okay.
And then go to full screen mode. And then you just use left, right arrows to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I had some help with this presentation, and I'm going to go through some of the slides pretty quickly. I got a lot of this information through Common Cause and spent a good bit of time talking with some of the people that work there the past week or so. So this is about districting or redistricting after you've started doing it. Here's the question. Why is redistricting important to me? A healthy democracy requires that voters choose politicians instead of politicians choosing voters. And I think that's sort of the crux of it. And we've talked a little bit about gerrymandering and what can happen when your elected officials decide what the district boundaries ought to be, and it's not always in the constituents' best interests. So it's important that we elect representatives that listen to the public in order to ensure that our votes matter. So here's a brief history. I'm not going to get into all of this, but I'll just give you the definition of redistricting. Redistricting is the generally once a decade process tied to the U.S. Census where election districts are redrawn to ensure that they remain substantially equal in population. And then in 1964, that was a landmark year when it was decided that districts must be of equal population and updated every 10 years. So that's when that first kind of came into being. So this is interesting. If you look at this pie chart, well, first of all, the state where you see the stars indicates areas where they've set up redistricting commissions. So you can see that a number of places have done this. And then this pie chart is redistricting in cities with by-district elections. So it shows that right now I think there's about 90 to 100 cities in California that have district elections, and we have, I think, over 400 cities total, maybe 450, I can't remember. So we're not there yet as far as catching up with the California Voting Rights Act. But of the cities that have transitioned to district elections, 22% have had advisory commissions, which have helped them through the districting process. And 17% have had independent commissions, and 61% have handled the process through their city council, which might mean the city council just votes at a board meeting to decide the districts with minimal public input. I mean, they'll have the input that Raul explained previously, but nothing beyond that. Or they might set up a subcommittee of the city council and then have a meeting at 2:00 in the afternoon when the public isn't there to approve the district. So stuff like that can happen. So that's kind of more common, I guess you could say at this point. So it's important that the public be aware that there are options about, how this be done. It's right now, as public members, all we can do is ask that the city council consider doing it through a committee or a commission. And that's what happened in Menlo Park, and I'll talk about that more later. So it's important to increase public participation and transparency. Here's an example of something that happened in Chula Vista with 10 community workshops, 11 public hearings, and 300 public comments. So that's sort of on the high end of outreach, and something that I'm not saying that that's going to happen here in Half Moon Bay, but I think your city council has a pretty good track record of doing public outreach. I mean, we've been talking about the listening sessions and some of the outreach that's been going on in the community, so I would be surprised if there wasn't an aggressive outreach process for this as well. At least I would hope that would happen. Here we have depoliticizing redistricting. And so this just talks a little bit about why you want to depoliticize redistricting, because there can be conflicts of interest, there can be abuses, there's partisan issues, inter-board conflicts. You could actually be on a board and end up in a huge fight with your fellow board members because of the way they want to district things, and then you're on a dysfunctional board, and so that's not healthy. There there could be retribution, there could be minority community disenfranchisement. I mean, there are just a lot of things that can go wrong, and so that's another reason. These are all reasons why you might want to go through a process that takes it to a more neutral body for evaluation versus having the actual elected board make all the decisions themselves. But bring it back. You could bring it back to the board then for recommendations, which is what happened in Menlo Park. So this, we've kind of talked about all this already, so I'm going to move on. And we're getting through it here. So local redistricting reform, new opportunities for counties and cities. So pre-2017, counties and cities may only establish advisory commissions, not independent commissions. Then there was SB 1108 in 2016, and now counties can now establish independent commissions. But is that true of cities too, or just counties?
Yeah, I think cities can too.
Okay, so I should have changed that to cities and counties can establish independent commissions. And to be clear, in Menlo Park, they didn't establish a commission, they established a committee. And in my opinion, a commission would be a better process, but a committee was a pretty good process compared to not doing any of this, which would not have been. Yes, help me here.
Sure, just really quick, right, HMB is a general law city, right?
Yes.
So what that means is, in terms of establishing the independent commission or committee, it'll be in the government code, I believe, what the sort of rules for the commission and that the city would have to operate in if it wanted to form one, as opposed to a charter city, you could kind of come up with anything you want.
Okay.
So you'll just have to look up in the government code, and I think Nicholas shared good resources for you.
Okay.
On what it could look like here.
On what that could be. So I'm going to move to the next slide because I cover a lot of the same stuff here. So this is about the city of Menlo Park, which is in the process of transitioning to district elections, and they have already had a committee established that made recommendations to the city council, and the city council adopted those recommendations. So they're far along in their process at this point. So what happened was a resident asked that Menlo Park adopt an ordinance to establish an advisory districting committee with help from the California Local Redistricting Project. The redistricting ordinance generator web tool was used to produce an ordinance. Now I know this sounds a little weird, but there is a website called localredistricting.org/generator that will spit out a ordinance that helps you establish one of these commissions or committees, and it basically does a lot of the work for your city staff. So you can, and the California Local Redistricting Project has a staff person assigned to help people like us get one of these ordinances done that's custom to their city. So they'll help you customize it so it's applicable to your city. So this is what happened in Menlo Park. A resident got in touch with the California Local Redistricting Project, told them that they were concerned about the process and wanted to make sure that the process was healthy, and wanted to help create a ordinance or a resolution for the city council to consider to set up a redistricting, or in this case, a districting committee. And so that is what the city council ended up doing. They adopted a resolution and they set up a committee, and the committee the way they selected committee members was very specific, very careful. I'm not going to get into all the details now. It would take too long. The resolution's quite long, and I have a copy if anybody wants it. But the committee members must meet a minimum criteria of impartiality. A committee member cannot be a candidate for elective office in Menlo Park 10 years commencing with the date of appointment. 4 years following appointment, committee members shall not accept employment as a city staff member, accept appointment to a city commission or another committee, or receive a non-competitive bid contract. So there are things built into this resolution or ordinance that help protect the public from, let's just say, inappropriate meddling in the process, to keep it clean and on the up and up and free of being politicized. And then the commission must meet transparency and public engagement requirements. So that is pretty much the end of my presentation. And here we have links which take you to the local redistricting website, the ordinance generator, and also sort of an interesting document, the California Municipal Democracy Index, which talks about lots of different locations and how they've dealt with it. And then there's a contact here, which is Nicholas, who is the staff person who helps people with these ordinances. So this presentation is going to be posted on our website at coasideprogressive.org, and I'm happy people can contact me at sabrina@dfm.com, and I'll be happy to email it or whatever, call me.
And we can give out the information tonight too.
Yeah. So so I really appreciate everybody coming tonight and sitting through this and learning about this, and it's something that I've been learning about since 2010, and it's of great interest to me, and I'm just happy to be able to share it with all of you.
Thank you.
Cookies.
Cookies and tea.
Let me eject it. Oh.